Welcome back to Birds of a Feather Talk Together. This week's episode is about the giant hummingbird. A recent study led by Jessie Williamson led to some groundbreaking discoveries about the giant hummingbird, including that they are actually two different species, one of which has the longest migration of any hummingbird species in the world. This amazing study, which included putting tiny backpacks on hummingbirds to track their movement, changed what we knew about hummingbirds. Hear about this study and more about these giant hummingbirds in this week's episode. Okay, go grab your binoculars out of your tiny backpack and let's get into it. All right, welcome back to Birds of a Feather Talk Together. This is RJ and I'm with John, Shannon, and Amanda, and today we're going to talk about the giant hummingbird. So we did our ruby-throated hummingbird episode about a month ago, and now I want to talk about the giant hummingbird because there's been some exciting news about the giant hummingbird. Is that right?
It definitely has.
Yeah, I always like to do things that people haven't heard about, like not just the things they see in their backyard. And when this research came out, I thought, well, we have to do this because most people will have no idea that this bird exists, that an 8-inch long hummingbird actually exists.
And may not just be one thing.
Well, it certainly isn't just one thing, actually. So that's, some of what we're going to talk about. But the extremes of size are always interesting to people, too. The idea that a bee hummingbird weighs what a penny weighs up to an ostrich, which, that's a huge variation in size of birds. But even within groups of birds that people know, hummingbirds, that there's tremendous variation in body size.
Yes.
And giant hummingbird earns its
So
name.
it's the largest hummingbird in the world. They weigh about 12 grams, which is, as Shannon was saying, it's probably about 5 or 6 times the size of a ruby-throated hummingbird, maybe a little more. And so it's interesting to think about that. If you had a human that was 5 or 6 times even these people like Yao Ming are not 5 or 6 times taller than the average human or the other species of primates. And so,
he came in the museum once a long time ago when he was still playing, and he had a leg injury, a foot injury at the time. And he came into the Pritzker lab. We gave him a tour of the Pritzker lab, and he had to duck to get through the door into the lab. And then he had to sit down because of he had a boot on his foot. And the boot on his foot was bigger than a car seat. First off, is what it looked like to me. It was a car seat. And he sat on one of the lab stools. Sitting on one of the lab stools, he was like 2 feet taller than anybody else in this space. I could not believe it. So this must be what some other little hummingbirds think of seeing a giant hummingbird is like, what on earth? What is this thing? Holy cow. How can this be part of my tribe?
and
That so tremendous.
and there are upwards of 300 species of hummingbirds in the world. And giant hummingbird is one of the less colorful ones, but they live in a really interesting distribution, mostly in the Andes, but then getting down into the lowlands. And so they go from southern Colombia down into Chile and Argentina. So they have a really long range, which turns out to be really interesting in terms of some of this recent research.
Yeah, it's long and narrow. So it's not, some of these things we think of widespread across South America, for example. But that is not what this hummingbird is like. Its range is relatively narrow along the west coast of South America, and that kind of range distribution always has some interesting consequences in an evolutionary sense. It's been that have been studied pretty extensively, and at least in some species, about how you get a distribution like that and how these birds move throughout the landscape. And that's some of what makes this giant hummingbird so interesting. And then again, it's something hiding in plain sight. So that's the lesson of this giant hummingbird to me, is that you don't know until you start to look. You don't know what you have until you start getting data or measuring. And there's always something new to learn, even on things that something people seem to know a lot about. That doesn't mean they know everything. And in this case, they don't even know the fundamental part. It was missing until this study was done. And so, and then again, like John said, they're not bright, they're not iridescent.
I actually think they're a little like your house sparrows, because I was looking at some photos online, and there's some gorgeous pictures
fair,
that look
actually.
like they do have some iridescent.
Yeah.
Are they like the size of a robin?
Yeah, almost. They're slender. They're more slender than a robin. They're smaller
Okay.
than a. But there's a huge variation in size between them too, which is part of this, a relevant part of this story we're about to tell about them. But they do hover, so there are parts of the time you would think that you would know you were looking at a hummingbird. They do, because they do hover, but then you're like, what the heck am I dreaming that a hummingbird is, 8 inches long? Am I really, or even longer? Am I dreaming that could be the case? But yeah, they do hover. So there are parts of their time they look like a hummingbird. Their wings don't beat nearly as much as a normal hummingbird that we would think about.
It's interesting when you think about aerodynamics. If you take a helicopter and say, try to make it 6 times larger, is it going to be able to fly using the regular mechanisms that you've got? And so one of the really interesting things about giant hummingbirds is they're actually a really old lineage, in the sense that they're very divergent from the sister taxa in the hummingbirds that they have. And those they've probably been separated from their sister species, which are also South American, for upwards of 10 to 12 million years. And the energetics of doing what they do in terms of flying is even further complicated by the fact that a big portion of the populations live up at high elevations in the Andes, where the air is a lot thinner. So that may be an aspect.
Yeah, how do you get enough oxygen to power those muscles, which you have, if you're going to hover, that's a lot of energy in a condition where, oxygen concentrations are down. If you've ever gone to high elevation, it doesn't go so well for me. I got sick almost immediately. I couldn't move. I fell asleep on top of a tent as I was trying to set it up. I just couldn't. I got nauseous. I could not function. My brain, your brain doesn't work. There's no way I could forage, for example. Are you kidding me? I couldn't have found the vehicle that was 50 feet from where I was trying to set up a tent. I was completely incapacitated. So think about a bird that is up at that elevation, hovering, trying to find food. It's cold. There's not enough oxygen. It's pretty intense. So ruby-throated, if you go look back at our ruby-throated hummingbird episode, they beat their wings at 53 beats per second, which when you think about that is just mind-boggling anyway.
It's pretty incredible, yeah.
The giant hummingbird beats its wings at 15 wing beats a second. So,
okay.
Like almost the same difference in size is the difference in wing beats per second. So there are limitations of how fast you can make your wing do what they have to do to hover.
Because do they have the different shoulder?
They do.
I think when we talked about ruby-throated, you told us about their shoulders are different from other birds that allows them to be able to.
Yeah. You can't have too many connections if you need to rotate your wings the way you have to do when you hover. So there's changes in certain muscles and differences in the attachments of muscles on the bones that enable them to manipulate their wings like that, which you could see if you looked at a skeleton or this is really nerdy. But John's been involved in this project called OVERT, where they have CT scans. So use the same imaging that we would use to look inside of us and see what's the matter with us, and in some cases the same machines that do that. You can look inside of a bird, and when you do that, you can see these different things. You can see the different places where muscles attach. You can see the different sizes of muscles. You can see the way the bones are different inside. And so there are places online where if you want to go look, you can look at the CT scans and you can compare just with your own eyes the CT scans that have been done of hummingbirds versus other birds. And you can kind of get a feel for the variation that exists inside a bird. It's a great project.
And one of the things I think with hummingbirds in particular is that I think what Giant Hummingbird illustrates is probably what early hummingbirds look like, and that the smaller birds have actually evolved over time from those larger species.
So they evolved to get smaller?
That's my guess.
Wow.
That's interesting. So I want to hear about the controversy. What is the new news on these guys?
The
wasn't a controversy so much as just a shocking new development in the confluence of bird specimens, field observations, genomics. Like all of these things kind of came together to tell a completely different story about what's happening and what has evolutionarily happened.
And this was the dissertation project of a student at the University of New Mexico in the Museum of Southwest Biology named Jessie Williamson. And her major advisor, Chris Witt, has worked on hummingbirds in Peru for a long time. And the basic setup is that giant hummingbirds had long been known to live at multiple elevations. So they're birds in the Andes, but they're also birds when you get south into Chile and Argentina that breed in the lowlands. And so they were interested in this because of the things Shannon was talking about before associated with high altitude physiology. And taxonomically, what they realized was, or what was recognized from history, is that there were two subspecies described in the literature, one from the north and one from the south, and they sort of separated at the down around the in Bolivia or in going into Argentina. But even as far back as Charles Darwin, when he was in Chile, he was told that the birds that breed in the lowlands of Chile are actually only there for part of the year. So there was an indication that these birds were moving, but nobody really knew where they moved to and what that meant. And that's what Jessie and in her dissertation actually figured out in a bunch of neat ways using some of the technologies that are available now.
Yeah, so she designed a little backpack. These hummingbirds are bigger, so you can do things with them that you couldn't do with a bee hummingbird or even ruby-throated, for example.
Oh, wow.
And so she designed her own little harness that to put the trackers on these birds. And first off, I mean, it's hard to, what she did is, this is one of these things where if someone had told you they were going to do this, if you're a major professor, you would say, I don't think so. You have to graduate. You can't stay in graduate school for 20 years. It seems like a 20-year project. But there was a team of people that were helping with this. But you have to capture the birds. So you have to capture these large, really smart, hovering birds. So a bird that can hover can see pretty well, and it's going to see this things called mist nets. So when we capture birds, we used, it's a fine net that has very small strings that we hope the bird flies into so that we can capture the bird and measure it, weigh it, maybe take feathers or blood, take poop, all of the things that we do to try to understand what birds are, how they live, where they go, what they do. But she had to capture enough, and it can't be just one, because if you find one, you have an anecdote. You don't have data. And so they had to use these mist nets to try to capture these hovering birds that are clearly really smart and could see the mist net. So it's like running through the forest with the butterfly net, except the butterfly net is 30 meters long, trying to capture these birds, trying to figure out how you trick them into needing to move so they'll fly into the mist net without hovering, seeing it, and flying over it. So, the audacity of thinking you can even do that is pretty amazing. So she designed these little backpacks. They succeeded in capturing 76 of these birds, which is a lot. That's a lot of work and a lot of people spending a lot of time trying to find out, experiment with how you're going to capture the birds, and put these little trackers on them to figure out, well, where do these birds go? if it weren't for this technology, you wouldn't be able to do this. This is why at Darwin's time, when people said, well, the bird clearly goes somewhere, well, it was there and now it's not going somewhere, but a human range of abilities to move is pretty darn small on average. It's not like you can follow it. You can't fly. You can't say, oh, it's leaving. It's going up in the air. Well, let me follow it. Well, okay, well, maybe I can follow it for a kilometer. Maybe I can follow it for 10 meters and it's gone.
So one of the thoughts was probably that they just moved up and down the Andes in the area of Chile and Argentina. And so it's because you had the way they were divided up taxonomically based on people's assessments of collections, which, turned out to be completely wrong, as we're going to find out, meaning that there was this north-south separation. The birds in the south disappear from the lowlands at a period of time. One of the possible things they could do is just go upslope at the same latitude, or longitude, up into the mountains.
And that's not so easy to even find either, right? So the idea that you're going to run up the Andes to try to find this bird that was in the lowlands yesterday and is now, you can't walk up this. The terrain is not conducive for things like this. This is really difficult. It's hard to walk even when you're not trying to track a bird. It's hard to go up and down these places.
With these multiple types of transmitter data, they had backpacks. They also used these things called geolocators, which occasionally ping satellites, but you need to catch the bird again in order to take the data and get it off of the geolocator.
Yeah, so it's bad enough you have to capture them first time to put these things on them, but then to get the data, you have to capture them again in places where you don't know where they go.
And so what it turns out it happens with these southern birds along the coast of Chile is that they fly north and they cross the Andes and they take a migration actually that if you look at a globe, and this, I'm still trying to get my mind around this because it illustrates, as much as I think I know about the geography of South America, I hadn't really thought about the magnitudes of this. But basically they they move northward. And again, this is going from austral summer. So this is, they breed in December and January in Chile, and they migrate northward into Peru, central Peru, cross the Andes, spend the winter up at these high elevations up there in the Andes, above 10,000 feet in many cases, and then come back down and cross the Andes again to get back to Chile to breed again. And so this was a completely unknown distribution. And what it indicates is that the southern birds actually overlap in the non-breeding season with these northern birds that have been called part of the, just a different subspecies.
And that are residents. So the northern birds don't migrate in that way. They're not going south, for example.
But then in the south, there are also these these birds that would essentially be part of the northern population. The northern population doesn't migrate, but it extends south of where the traditional subspecies barrier had been. And so what they found out in this study was that the subspecies designations meant nothing. And there were these major behavioral differences that really warranted considering these two things as different species, even though they're fairly similar looking, because behaviorally they're doing completely different things in terms of their breeding biologies.
And it turns out genomically they're very different too. So even though they look the same, they've been all mixed up in
collections like ours.
Cases for collections like ours for forever, and a lot of people have looked at those collections, and yeah, you see variation in both size, streakiness, how brown or how not brown they are. But lots of species have lots of variation in them. But it took kind of this technology with these people to make that big leap into what they're doing and why. I mean, this is one of those things where if you'd have suggested this 20 or 30 years ago, people would have just said you're crazy, which is what they did to a lot of young women who tried to do things. It's just said you're crazy. I've been called crazy more than once in my career for thinking things that are not in the mainstream. Sometimes when you didn't grow up in the mainstream, you think outside of the box, and that's a good thing, but it's people want to put you in the box. They don't want your ideas to be outside the box. So likely if this had been proposed a while ago, people would have just shaken their head at her. She was in the museum last week, actually, because what she found, good science never answers any questions. It just generates more. And so she thinks she's moving on to new projects, but this one, there's so many dimensions of it, it won't free her. Because there's so many things she can do with this study system that you didn't know beforehand, and that you can't just quit.
So was she studying the specimen at the Field Museum then?
Yep. So we have some of the best.
Because it turns out we have both of them. Both of these.
We have some of the
okay.
best collections around for Chilean birds, and then we have a really good collections for Bolivia and Peru as well that have been made over the years. And so there's a lot of interesting stuff associated with the history of collecting of giant hummingbirds in terms of what they led to people interpreting things the way they did originally with this north-south thing. But the other thing I wanted to emphasize is that these migratory birds, I hadn't really thought about how much geographic distance there is in this linear distribution that Shannon was talking about earlier, such that these birds are migrating distances that are equivalent to what you see in North America with a bird like Rufus hummingbird, which is really well known for breeding almost all the way up to Alaska and then wintering down in Central America. And so that to me seems like an incredibly long distance. I wouldn't have guessed the distance that these giant hummingbirds are moving would be as long, and yet it actually is when you get out the globe and look at it.
So, and once she knew part of the story, there's all these other dimensions that become really interesting. So, I mean, if you're going to be a mountain climber, you don't just go from, sea level to Mount Everest in one day. Not if you want to actually function. That's not how humans do it, right? You stage yourself at varying altitudes before you can do the big climb to get to the top of things. And it turns out these hummingbirds do the exact same thing. They don't fly immediately up to the highest of elevations. They stage themselves at different elevations along the way, and the same thing that happens to people when they go higher happens to the birds too. They get better oxygenation in their lungs as they stage themselves and go higher and higher and higher. And so in order for them to live on their outside of their breeding grounds at that high elevation, they take a long time, sometimes, months to move into this new habitat, because it's energetically, they still got to make a living by finding flowers and hovering and stuff like that. So you still need to have enough energy. It's just harder to do that when the air is thin and the oxygen concentrations are down. So they stage themselves just like people would, which is, to me, that's just completely fascinating. And then there's all these adaptations that birds have to live at higher elevations. So the ones that live up there all the time have bigger lungs, larger lung capacity, for example. And they do that they have that all the time, but it takes a while to get there. They have variations in their hemoglobin genes that let them capture the oxygen better, that have better affinity for oxygen, that if you're at lower elevations, you don't have. So there's a whole series of just fascinating things physiologically, behaviorally, that have to happen in order for you to live at high elevation like that. But this bird does that. It doesn't just evolve 10 millions of years ago and stay at the high elevations, which a lot of hummingbirds do. These ones actually do that on an annual basis, right? They're moving half of the year, they're spending it at high elevation, the other half they're spending at low elevations, and then they're going from one to the other, which, that's pretty extreme kinds of behavior. So it's fascinating in every conceivable way.
So one of the big questions for us from an evolutionary standpoint is this it's almost one of these chicken and egg type things, which is which evolved first, the migratory species or the non-migratory species. And those become really hard things to figure out when you only have one system that you're able to look at.
I feel like Amanda and I both lived at elevation in the Rockies, and they say it takes like close to a year to get acclimated. It's like, you get out there and your body really takes like a full year to get used to being at like the thinner air and everything. It's like, I don't know, pretty incredible that these hummingbirds, like throughout the course of a couple months, will like work their way up and get acclimated, like each stage all the way up there. I mean, that's pretty amazing.
That's why hockey teams tank when they go play the Colorado Avalanche, because they're not staging themselves to get there, right? So it's a difficult transition for our hockey teams to make from southern Florida, for example, where you're probably below sea level in some of these places, up to in Denver, where the Colorado Avalanche play hockey. That's unnoticeable. And our son has done that too. And he says it's really noticeable when you go play in high elevation places. You get more tired, your body has problems.
Yeah. I wonder, so speaking of that, I know that like the Colorado Rockies, like it's easier to hit a home run at elevation because the air's thinner. I wonder if there's any correlation to flying and, thinner air, if it's, I don't know.
Like it's easier or?
I have no idea. I don't know. I just wonder if there's any impact that it would have on a bird.
It takes more work to stay aloft.
Oh, okay. Sure.
And so you have to, that's why getting affinity to oxygen is so important, right? You have to do everything you can to extract the oxygen to power your wings at that elevation. Otherwise, you're going to be panting, the way we do when we go up there, and your brain doesn't get enough oxygen, you can't function. So birds experience the same things. If you took a sea level bird and expected it to do whatever it was going to do at, 10,000 feet, it's going to have trouble. And that could just be a normal bird. But if you look at a hummingbird, where the energetics are so much higher than an average bird because of the way it forages, it's hovering, all of these things that are so energetically demanding. If there's any place that's going to show adaptations to high elevations, it's going to be in hummingbirds.
So from my perspective as a biogeographer, I'm really interested in the history of these landscapes. And South America and the Andes in particular are really interesting in that sense, because they're the result of these plates coming together and uplift happening. And the areas where these giant hummingbirds occur, that uplift started roughly about 20 million years ago. But what I always like to think about is the word started. And so we don't know how long it took for the Andes to begin to get as high as they are today. But it's probably within the last 2 to 5 million years that they've actually gotten really high. And so I think that's one of the things that suggests that it's quite possible from my perspective that the migratory bird is basically an ancestral form where they breed in the lowlands, but then as the Andes came up, they started moving into the highlands, and that led to the formation of the highland species. But that's all storytelling right now. The question is how do you get the data that can actually prove it one way or the other?
Yeah. Wow.
That's pretty interesting to think about.
Yeah.
So giant hummingbirds then could I just, because I don't understand all this, they could predate kind of the forming of the mountains.
Or at least be contemporaneous with respect to things happening. And
wow.
Yeah, I mean, with phylogenies, we can do some interesting...
Yeah. There's also...
Go ahead, Jenna.
And there's no suggestion that these things interbreed. I mean, there might be one hybrid that Jessie has uncovered. But so it's the things that are moving north and living at high elevation, when they're not breeding, they're not staying there, right? Which is an interesting aspect of it. They're going back. You'd think that, well, maybe I just am too tired. Why am I going to go back? These things are living here perfectly fine. I'm just going to join them. Well, they don't do that, which is also interesting to me. And we don't know. They look so similar. It's hard to imagine from our perspective what might mean they don't they don't think of interbreeding or anything like that. But they're so tied to going back to their breeding grounds.
So even though I'm not thinking of, I have trouble thinking about this from a sort of southern hemisphere perspective. What I think it may be going on here is something called migratory drop-off, where we see this in birds like they're what's a good example? They're non-migratory populations of sandhill cranes in Florida, and those have derived from these crane populations that are breeding up in the high Arctic and migrating down every year, and some of them have just stopped migrating and started breeding there. And so we know that happens in certain taxa, and this would be a much older example of something like that if you could convince yourself that that's what's going on.
But then why don't they do it repeatedly?
I wonder if well, again, this is complete storytelling.
I mean,
right?
I don't know.
So the interesting thing about the Andes is that it's this unique mountain chain in some levels because it's so long in terms of the running the length of the entire continent. But we know that the southern area is uplifted before the central and northern areas did. And so it may have been that over time what you had was this population that evolved in the south, was actually starting to migrate as the mountains formed and moving up into the highlands. But eventually a population got isolated up in the highlands, maybe further north than the average birds migrate, got genetically distinct, lost the capacity to migrate, and then gradually began to expand south as the mountains continued to rise up. There's a story.
So the northern one needs a new name.
Oh, wow.
Which is interesting,
Wow.
right? So they have subspecies names as, part of Patagonia gigas, or I'm not sure how you say that. So, but they doesn't get to keep that name anymore because the southern one gets the name. So the northern one gets a new name, and they've proposed Patagonia chasqui as the new name, which I think is actually charming too. So it's inspired by the Quechua term for the flat-footed messengers of the Inca Empire. So these runners that were known for their large lungs and ability to transport messages and goods from one place to another. So that's where the name of the new northern one comes from, which I think is really great.
That's cool.
Oh, I love that. Yeah.
So when new bird books are published, I guess that's like not down to the consumer level, but like in new literature, will that name be used?
Yeah. And the interesting thing, if you look at the Birds of the World website right now that Cornell runs, this is not, you don't see this yet. So that's how new this kind of thing is, that it takes a while for this to be, even in online resources, it takes a while for science to kind of perpetuate itself into what would be a more public form, right? Going to Birds of the World, you will see this study represented in what this is. And I like that idea. That's an advantage of technology too, because certain things are just, you need to be able to update them. It's hard to update field guides. It's easier to update eBird or Merlin or something like that with modern science that can then help you get more science. And to me, that's like a real advantage of technology. None of this would have been possible without technology. And, they sound different too. So recordings, when people go into the field with recordings, which you can even do with Merlin, right? You don't need sophisticated recording equipment to record these birds. Better recordings you get with those, but you don't have to have that now because the technology that's inside your phone is so good that people can record them everywhere, and there will be more elements of their distribution or aspects of variation that you can see with these new technologies to keep adding on to the story, which is why Jessie is never going to finish this part. She might she'll start new ones, but this one will never be finished for her career. Yeah. She's about to be a professor at the University of Wyoming, which is cool. A great thing for her. And she's got a postdoctoral experience that she has right now at Cornell University. So that's what happens. You get a PhD, then you do a postdoc, and then if you're lucky, you get a job, or in Jessie's case, if you're really good, you get a job as a professor somewhere. But these processes are pretty grueling, and a lot of people end up being weeded out of science because of how hard it is to get a job as a professor. Universities are really good at making administrators, a lot of administrators, and expanding their org chart that way. They're way less good at putting their resources into the science that happens at universities, which is such a driver for science everywhere, and educating young people into taking them out of the place that they grew up in and making them better citizens of the world. And I'm not sure an administrator does that, frankly, no offense, but it's not. Universities can be super annoying in that sense of generating this class of people who are pretty highly paid. Most professors, biology professors at least, outside of medical schools, are not very highly paid. And so there's been investment against having long-term professors into what are called contingent faculty, so people who are hired, and a lot of that is what happens to women, where they don't have a research lab, they teach a lot, and they teach for relatively little pay, often having to teach at multiple universities. And so that's not a very stable life for people like that. Anyways, now I'm off on my tangent to the fact that universities need to return to their fundamental job, which is not to make fancy athletic facilities or
So what you're saying is kudos to the University of Wyoming.
Yeah.
Yes, I know.
Wyoming,
Yeah, good for them.
Yeah.
I think that's actually really true, that their resources are going into science and education, which is what universities should be. They shouldn't be professional sports places. Even though I love college athletics, don't get me wrong, our son was a college athlete. It's important. But, that in most states, the most highly paid person in the entire state is the football coach. Is, I think, that's a little askew. The value system is a little.
So you would like to see it be the ornithology curator?
Yeah.
Yes, I would.
Yes.
And
Right
and there's no ancestor of ours that will ever see such a thing, John. Let's just say.
Wait.
No matter
Maybe
how many
birding gets
generations
popular
you
enough.
go.
Your descendants, yeah.
And that's not, yeah.
So
We need
as far
competitive birding. Yeah.
Yeah. I was just to put this discovery in perspective, how often does something like this come up?
That's an interesting question. I was thinking of a couple of examples that we've had in our research. So it's not completely unusual, and yet at the same time, I think the story here and how well it's told is what really, and the fact that it's a giant hummingbird is what really makes it so fun to think about and talk about.
So Jessie was the first author on a paper that came out sometime in the last few months that was in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. It's a very prestigious journal for our field, but the way it was written, it might be one of the best written papers I've seen in a super long time, because her ability to speak clearly with, even though it's a complicated subject, to make a paper that is very approachable and readable, that's pretty masterful, and not very many people are good at that. So this paper is extremely well written. It's very easy to understand what it is that they're getting at, even though it's a very complex set of moving pieces to tell the story too. So good for her.
That's awesome. Shannon and I totally, for my work, I read a lot of clinical journal articles, and I know what you mean. If it's harder to understand, then the reporting of it is not as good. So I totally know what you mean. That makes a lot of sense.
So hearing literature, I've been trying to read a lot of hearing literature to try to understand what people know and how they know it. And I mean, I'm trained in this, right? I have a PhD in science. I didn't start understanding any of this, but by now I should be able to read a paper and understand its basic premise, no matter what it is. And I can't. A lot of this hearing literature just makes me crazy. Like, use plain language. What is this abstract? This is dumb. Come on, people. You want people like me to be able to approach the literature to understand how I might treat my own hearing loss. Am I waiting for there to be a new technology? Are there things on the horizon? How would I know? How do I know if my doctor is up to date on some of these things? Well, for me, I'm going to scour the literature myself because that's what I do. But I find this literature opaque, and that leaves people out, and I don't like that. That's why this podcast is so important to me. I don't want to leave people out. And if I can't explain it so that the average person can understand it, I ought not be getting the people's money to do this research. Yes, there's a place where you have scientific literature where it's very technical, but that shouldn't be in a museum. Museum tells stories, right? We're all storytellers. And I don't want to tell the story that only the 5 people in the whole universe that know about what I'm talking about understand. I think we can do better than that. I think we should do better than that. Most scientists aren't trained to do better, and we're lucky there are people like Jessie who innately have the ability to tell a story in a way that not just scientists can understand it, but that normal people can understand it too. We should all be trained
amazing,
like that. We need to practice things like that too. I mean, you, Amanda, that must be the most important thing in your job, is to try to get scientists to use normal language to explain what it is that they are doing. You can't tell their stories of their amazing scientific findings if they can't tell you what they did.
You're right, Shannon. And what you're saying totally reminds me of John, because John is like the one that hooked RJ and me, because like he was so relatable and so interesting. And you're so right. I mean, that's what gets people in.
Well, you don't get big bucks for it, though. No. There's no get rich quick scheme from being a good science communicator.
All right. Well, I think we're getting close on time. We do have a mailbag question. You guys want to jump into a mailbag question before we close it out?
Sure.
Okay. So this is from Richard B., and he said he's from the Pittsburgh area. And Richard said, "Howdy, folks. Great job. You quickly have become my favorite podcast. Red-eyed vireos and house wren have settled in here in the Pittsburgh area after migration at our house, and they paired up and built nests. They've been singing up a storm. But last week, neither I nor Merlin have heard or seen the vireo, and now for the past 4 to 5 days, the house wrens have not been heard from or seen. Where have they gone? Do I blame the cowbirds, who seem to have increased in numbers?"
Ooh, so we could do an entire set of episodes on that question. So let's take it this way. So house wren and red-eyed vireo are both absolutely incessant singers when they get on their territory, as we've talked a little bit about. And so you really notice them, which is really, one of the calling cards for those two birds. They're really different in the sense that our red-eyed vireos are spending the winter in South America, whereas house wrens are wintering in the southern part of the U.S. And ever since COVID, really, I've spent more time watching birds and thinking about what happens when they're trying to pair up. And red-eyed vireos are actually really hard to look at this way because you can't see them very well up in the trees and things, so they're hard to watch. House wrens aren't that hard to look at. And so we've got a house wren right now that's been singing up a storm, and we've actually seen birds that I thought were not calling, that could be females, going into the nest, the nest site that he's been, coming down and singing in front of and stuff. And for whatever reason, there's no female in there. And so I think the females shop around. So it could be that he's in an area where there aren't very many females, and the males that are there of both species are actually trying to set up territories and not finding.
Or that they took off, and that's why they're quiet. But it's not a good idea if you're a female sitting on a nest to make noise like that. Tell all the predators, hey, here I am. that time of year.
Okay.
Come find my babies
So-
and eat them.
So vireos,
So there's a lot of quietness
But-
happen at that time during the
but
nesting.
vireos
part.
are really crazy in that sense, in that I've seen multiple species of vireos actually sing on their nests, which is I don't understand, and I can't.
Are they looking to have sex outside their relationship? And
No idea. I don't know if red-eyed vireos do it, but Bell's vireos.
maybe they're just so programmed to sing at certain times a year that they can't
I
help
mean,
it.
I think that's
I
the.
can't help it. Just like you want to control your own behavior and you can't.
But coming back to the question, I think it illustrates the complexity of a system where basically males are setting up territories, singing and hoping to attract females. And if a female doesn't show up, or the other possibility is maybe the female did show up and they're actually not singing quite as much because they're busy actually feeding the young. And
Okay.
again, I think those are really interesting questions, and different species across the bird world do things in lots of different ways with respect to that.
So it
So
could
he
be
should
a
keep
good
looking.
thing.
Yeah, he could have baby birds in his yard.
Okay.
Or in the
that's
parks
good.
that he goes to or something like that. That's why you keep looking, right? So we only all know these things when
Yeah,
people
one of my
keep
favorite
looking.
examples like that is white-breasted nuthatches in our area seem to me to get completely quiet once they've got an active nest. They stop calling pretty much.
But we had one at our camera feeder. I did not hear that bird, but when I came home from the museum, and I always look at the pictures and the videos that come from the camera that day, I'm like, I have not heard a nuthatch in our yard, but there was one at the feeder.
Oh, that's awesome.
So there's lots of things we don't see. And unfortunately, you can't ask the bird, like, what the heck are you doing? Why? So you have to use your own powers of observation, which requires dedication and note-taking. So take notes. Because sometimes you think things are the case, but they're not. And when you look back at your notes, you're like, oh, yeah, it really did do that. Or it did do that yesterday and the day before. I just forgot. So if you want to track it down, keep a notebook around and take notes about it.
Well, thanks, Richard, for the
Yeah,
question.
great
and
question.
Send us a follow-up. Like, keep paying attention, like John and Shannon said, and let us know if you notice anything.
Yeah, and go watch Pittsburgh play hockey. That would be my other suggestion. You have one of the best hockey players that's ever existed in your city. Go watch Sidney Crosby. Besides, they're Penguins, right? The team name is Penguin. So if you're interested
Yes,
in
we
birds,
approve.
go
Yes.
watch.
How did they get the penguins as their mascot? I didn't think
Yeah.
about that until now.
I don't know. That's
Yeah,
for
I think-
next
I
time.
think-
The zoo?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know.
All right, well, I think that's a good place to call it then. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. We appreciate the support. Please make sure to hit the subscribe button in your podcast app so you always get our newest episodes when they're released. Also, thanks, everyone, for leaving us a rating and review on the podcast app. We really appreciate it. If you have a question for us, please reach out to podcast.birdsofafeather@gmail.com. See you all next week. Love you all, each and every one of you. Thanks for listening.